Hi everyone, welcome to another Canyon Conversations with Stokes Nature Center. I am Michelle, one of our naturalist educators. We're going to continue on. If you followed us last week on Canyon Conversation, we talked about monarch butterflies with amateur butterfly enthusiast Becky Yeager. So we're going to talk today about milkweed, which many of you know. Milkweed is the only plant that monarch butterflies can live and eat. So it's very important for them, but also for a lot of other reasons, and it has a pretty interesting history. So we'll cover that, and I will end by showing you how to separate the seeds from the fluff that you'll find inside these seed pods right here. So to get started, Ralph Waldo Emerson said, "What is a weed? A weed is a plant whose virtues just haven't been discovered yet." So I hope by the end of today's Canyon Conversations that you, like me, will think that maybe it's time to take the weed out of the name of milkweed, because it often is misunderstood throughout history and often even still today. So I'm going to start out with a few milkweed myths, some reasons that maybe you've heard or maybe you feel that way yourself. That milkweed maybe isn't so good. Let's see if we can sway your minds. So one that sometimes we've heard is that milkweed is invasive. It is not. Milkweed is native. There's over 100 different species of milkweed found across the United States. We've got about 15 throughout Utah and about 5 here in Cache Valley. The most common that you're going to see here in Cache Valley is swamp milkweed and fancy milkweed, also some common milkweed. So usually they'll have kind of a pinkish or purplish flower on them. Myth number 2 is that milkweed is only useful to monarch. And that's understandable for people to believe because it is pushed so much to plant milkweed to help our monarchs because it is critical to monarchs. Monarchs can't survive without it. It is the only plant that their caterpillars can eat. So that is where they do lay their eggs and also go into their chrysalises. So that is about the only place you will find monarchs. They will starve to death if they are put on different plants. But they're not the only pollinators that use milkweed. So a lot of other insects and even birds will use milkweed. So other butterflies, moths, beetles, ladybugs, even hummingbirds can all use milkweed. And up to about 1/3 of the food that we eat relies on pollinators to grow. And milkweed can be a very important source for those pollinators. So if we want to keep those pollinators around to help pollinate our other plants that we ourselves like to eat, milkweed is a good, useful way to do that. Because milkweed is toxic, you shouldn't plant it. Milkweed is toxic, mildly toxic, so the white milky fluid that you might see coming out of milkweed can be toxic. So you will want to be just cautious with that if you get any of that on your hands or if you're with your kids. Just make sure they don't touch their eyes. That doesn't mean you shouldn't plant it. So those toxins, it would take a lot of milkweed to actually hurt an animal. And milkweed actually tastes really nasty. So if it is in a field with cattle or horses or other livestock, they're most likely not going to touch it unless they're really hard up for other food. So you can rest assured that the milkweed in your fields is not going to get eaten and not going to hurt your livestock. They'd also have to eat quite a bit of it for it to actually hurt them. This is one of the reasons monarchs like milkweed so much and other insects is because those toxins make monarchs unpalatable or untasty to predators and can help protect them as well. They still do have a lot of predators, but the toxins that they can absorb from eating that milkweed can help them to stay alive longer. So those are just a few myths that maybe you've heard about milkweed that aren't actually true. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the history of milkweed because it is rather fascinating. So the stalk of the plant, Native Americans use that for cording or rope. So if you take that stalk, cut out the milkweed, and you roll that, all that white milky stuff's going to come out that we just talked about. So of course, you're going to be a little bit careful with that. But once you get all that out of it, it's got really strong fibers. So they just roll it until all the milky sap is out of it, and then they could weave it to create rope and cording. In the early 1800s, late 1700s, it was used for mattress stuffing and other uses. And the really interesting one, I think, is in World War II. It was used to stuff PFDs, or life jackets, the Mae West style life jackets. So there's actually a big campaign across about 29 states in the U.S., mostly east of the Mississippi. So we didn't get in on the action out here in Utah, really, but east of the Mississippi and through Canada, they relied on children to collect milkweed pods to fill PFDs. What happened is those used to be stuffed with a material that came from the kapok tree, which grows in Indonesia, was the main source for that material. So it's a tree that produces a cottony fiber that they would harvest to fill the life preservers. And when the Japanese gained control of Indonesia, that supply was cut off. So we had to be a little bit creative, and they came up with the idea of planting milkweeds. Well, we couldn't just plant them because it takes 3 years before they actually produce those seed pods. So they had to rely on the wild populations of milkweeds, and they'd recruit school children to collect those. So about 2 bags could make 1 life preserver. So pretty large bags. You can see that's some picture of some children actually in Wisconsin that have collected milkweed bags. And they get about a nickel per bag for collecting milkweeds. So this is just an ad that ran in that Wisconsin newspaper that other photo came from, advertising the need for milkweed floss and to get people out there collecting it. So an estimated 11 million pounds of milkweed pods were collected by the end of World War II. So you can imagine that filled probably quite a few life preservers. So milkweed today, the biggest use, of course, is for our pollinators. We're really learning how beneficial pollinator habitat is, and milkweed is one plant that is really easy to cultivate and to add into your flower beds or garden to attract those pollinators. And of course, as I mentioned, our food is dependent on those pollinators, as well as just a healthy environment, and they're really fun to see. Just some other fun uses though, there are some companies that are experimenting with using the milkweed floss. So the fluffy stuff, you see the seeds are all attached to these pods, and these are actually really strong, really soft fibers. So if you collect them, you can feel just how strong and soft these fibers actually are. So there's several companies that have experimented with using that. There is a company in Canada right now that does sell some winter outerwear that they stuff with milkweed. So they advertise that as a vegan product, which of course it is. And it's actually really warm, so they just use it to replace the down that you traditionally find in winter parkas, sleeping bags, and things like that. So, but of course, the biggest thing that you can use milkweed for is just to plant that around your yards or garden to help out our pollinators, including our monarchs. So remember when you're out collecting to leave at least 2/3 of the seed pods or so on the plant so the wild population can repopulate. Pretty simple process. Collect the pods. If you need to, you can let them dry for 2 weeks or even more. Then separate the seeds, and you can either store them in your fridge or freezer or somewhere cool and dry, or you can go ahead and plant them right now in the fall, and they'll go through what's called that cold stratification period, which is important to help them germinate. They can go through that naturally in the ground. So I will show you now how to actually separate the seeds and tell you a little bit more about that process. All right, guys, I'm going to show you now how to separate the seeds and store them. So your milkweed pods are going to look like this. When you're out, if you're out picking these along ditch banks or along the edges of fields, is really good places to find the milkweed. They like full sun, but they also need access to water. So those ditch banks make really good places to find them. So you're gonna look for them. A lot of them are bursting open, and you can just collect like the fluff with the seed still attached. This one's all gone to seed. Or if the pods haven't burst yet, you should see the seam just starting to come open, or if you kind of just gently push on it and that pops open, they should be ready. So to separate the floss from those seeds, I'm going to teach you two ways. So one way is just, if it's still together, like this pod here, we're going to peel it open. And I'm going to grab the top, just like that. And then if you have some paper, or in front of me, I've just got a cookie sheet. You just take your thumb and rake over that and separate all the seeds. So you can see those seeds separated very nicely from the floss. So then once you get most of them, you can either just throw this away, or maybe you want to save it and try and stuff a parka or sleeping bag. So that's one way to do it. If the milkweed you've collected is to the point you can't really get it out like that, if it's kind of already popping open, like this one for example is already burst open, but we can still take the fluff, put it inside a bag. So a Ziploc or else a brown paper bag will work, whatever kind of bag. So I'll just grab, I've got a bunch of these. This is the time of year you're probably going to see more that have actually gone to seed and burst open, that you might need to use this method more. Just go ahead and put it in that bag and then add a few coins. So I've already got a few pennies in here. You can hear them. And then I'm going to close that up and just shake that around. And the pennies will help separate the seeds from that white fluff. And the seeds will start to kind of sink to the bottom. So then you can just cut just a little hole in the corner of your bag. Keep shaking. If you can see, but those seeds are starting to drop out that hole as I separate them. All right, so that's two ways to separate. And then when you've got your seeds all separated, ready to go, there's some nice seeds. They go through what's called cold stratification naturally. So you've got two options. You can either go ahead and plant these right now, and they'll naturally go through that cold stratification in the ground, or you can store them somewhere cool and dry. So that could be your refrigerator, or if you've got an outdoor room or shed where they'll stay cold and dry, you can use that. You want to make sure before you store them they are nice and dry. If they're not dry, they will mold. So a brown paper bag is a good way to store them because that will prevent that mold. But you can use plastic bags, like plastic Ziploc bags. Just make sure that these are very dry so you don't get mold. Some other tips, as you're out gathering the pods, just make sure that you leave about 2/3 of those pods still attached to the plant, so that the wild population has enough to continue to thrive and do well. And then if they're still really green, you can let these pods just kind of chill somewhere nice and dry for a couple weeks until they're nice and dry before you actually do this. And just experiment with which method works better. You may need to use both depending on what stage the seed pods are in that you've collected. Once you've planted them, it's important to remember not to spray milkweed because that residue can stay on the plant and also in the soil for several years, which can affect the monarchs. So we want to avoid spraying those pesticides. And it will take, when you do plant these, it takes about 3 years before those plants, they'll keep coming back, but before they're mature enough to produce these seed pods. So if you don't have milkweed in your yard, a good place to start, like I said, is looking for some of those wild populations. I hope you enjoyed learning a little bit about milkweed, and hopefully you can find some to collect and plant so that you can enjoy some of our monarchs next year. It's kind of the end of the season this year. You may still see a few stragglers. I saw one today. But thank you for helping out our pollinators, in particular our monarch butterflies. If you missed our last canning conversation with Becky Yeager about monarch butterflies, be sure and check that out because, of course, they're one of the reasons that milkweed is so important to us here. We will see you all next time on Canning Conversations in 2 weeks. Bye, everyone.